This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Ladies and gentlemen, could you be kind enough to take your seats and perhaps we can begin? Thanks kindly. My name is Peter Marshall, and it's my pleasure to introduce the last session. I'm a retired academic with an interest in empire, and I would like to say how grateful I am to OSPA for allowing me to take part in this splendid conference, and also for its generosity to people like me, in that it allows us to have a kind of associate status with OSPA and to read its excellent magazines and to keep in touch with what goes on, and I very much appreciate that. We've got to our delight for this last session some very portentous-looking phrases. We are going to talk about law, we're going to talk about democracy, and we're going to talk about economy. And I think we have a beautifully matched team of people to take us through these great themes, because we have both a very, very highly qualified academic political scientist, and that is Dr. Harshan Kumarasingham. Dr. Kumarasingham, who will speak first, has two distinguished monographs to his record. One with the splendid title of Onward with Executive Power, which is actually about New Zealand. But he's also completed a very important book, A Political Legacy of the British Empire, Power and the Westminster System in Post-Colonial India and Sri Lanka. He has a research fellowship at the Potsdam University, and he is going to be a research fellow at Cambridge. Our second speaker is the Honourable Anson, who has a most remarkable career. She joined the Hong Kong Civil Service in 1962. By 1993, she had risen to the highest position in the civil service under the governor. She was Chief Secretary. She remained Chief Secretary in the new system after 1997 until she left the civil service in 2001. But then she developed a new career as a practicing politician. And she created what is called a core group for constitutional reform in Hong Kong, and she's been elected to the Legislative Council. I think it's very unusual for somebody both to be an immensely distinguished civil servant and then to become a legislator. And one feels a lot of sympathy for the civil servants who are summoned in front of her, because she, of course, knows how it should be done and why it has not been done properly on these occasions. She has been honoured in all sorts of ways, honoured very highly in Hong Kong itself, in Britain and in France, where she is a Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur. But it's my pleasure to ask Dr. Kumarasingham to speak first.
Thank you very much. In August 1960, there was a dinner party in New York, and John Kenneth Galbraith, the famous economist, met former Edward VII, the Duke of Windsor. And the Duke had heard that Galbraith was going as Kennedy's ambassador to India. And the Duke said to Galbraith, "I hear you're going to India, the most interesting country, and you will find the people there most agreeable in their own way. You must try the pig sticking." In Jaipur. And he finished by saying, "They've been most uncommonly decent to my niece." And in many ways, India and the Commonwealth have been uncommonly decent to the system that the Queen represents. And that's what I hope to discuss today, looking at the legacy of the Westminster system in the Commonwealth. Obviously, in 15, 20 minutes, I can't go through all the countries, but I'll have a go. So that was the 1960s, and if I look at my own country, New Zealand. It's almost 3 years ago to the day that Britain got its first coalition government for a very long time. And Sir Gus O'Donnell, the British Cabinet Secretary, rather than look at, say, comparable examples in continental Europe, instead made the long trip to Wellington to look at how New Zealand operates with a proportional representation system, where we've had coalition governments since the 1990s. So in that respect, in a technical fashion, the Queen of New Zealand has already had over 4 coalition governments, so can teach the Queen of England a few things indeed. And that's, in some ways, the essence of what I wish to talk about today, that well after the end of empire, the Westminster system continues to pervade across the Commonwealth. Whether it's the right model is another matter, but nonetheless, it has been exported. So apart from the 16 realms, which some have discussed today, from Canada to Papua New Guinea and the West Indies, the Queen is where the Queen is still head of state. There are also the many Commonwealth parliamentary republics, from the world's largest democracy, India, to another country we discussed today, Malta, where this is still seen as the system of choice. Why has this been the case? Why has the British spent so much time writing constitutions for other countries? As Linda Collier's recently said, the British seem to be very good at writing constitutions for everyone but themselves. In many ways, one of the reasons perhaps is that, unlike, say, the American or the French models, the Westminster system is purposely built on convention and ambiguity. So a lot is left to the holders themselves of how they interpret and apply the system from themselves. There is, as Lord Addison said in the 1940s, who was Attlee's Commonwealth Secretary, the first one, that it is a system with flexibility, with freedom. And I think it's important to realise that for many, that we've looked at what Britain did, in many ways the Westminster system was the choice of the local elites themselves, rather than a system that was imposed upon them. And one of the reasons, at least I think, that the Westminster system was taken on rather than these other models is the flexibility that it allowed the local elites to sometimes manipulate the system, misuse the system, abuse the system, or sometimes even improve the system. And this was in the rather chaotic context that countries found themselves in the time of decolonisation. It gave them this flexibility when hard and fast rules would have been quite difficult to apply. And it's important, I think, that because of that, there's really no idealised Westminster model. The British system itself, with the Queen as head of state and all the centuries of evolution of a political system, could not, of course, be easily exported to anywhere else. So that laid itself for the possibility for these different interpretations. So countries as close as, say, even New Zealand and Australia have different, though on the outset having exactly the same Westminster system, have different interpretations of what that means and how it's done. So interestingly, despite the nationalistic need to make a change from Britain, so many countries in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean still wanted, as Philip Murphy has said, the Made in England mark on their constitutions right up until the 1960s. But interestingly, that as many people have talked today about the people on the ground, like many of yourselves, how many of the people on the ground from the British colonial service and diplomatic service were unsure whether this actually was the right thing to do and whether it would suit the very different circumstances which the British system found itself And even someone like Attlee, who, of course, did so much with the decolonization in South Asia, actually privately considered whether it would be better to have the American model in India. But the Indians themselves did not want that. Whereas someone, a distinguished politician, civil servant, and diplomat, Malcolm MacDonald, said in a private report to Harold Macmillan, "None of the Asian peoples are by nature fitted to govern themselves by a system of parliamentary democracy on the Westminster model. For many centuries, they have been used to authoritarian rule. Personal, self-seeking, nepotism, corruption, and some other habits, which are usually nowadays regarded as vicious in the Occident, but as wholly natural and tolerable in the Orient, make it too damaging inroads into the proper operation of Western parliamentary government. I do not predict that democracy or the Westminster model will last in Asia." So that was written in 1958. But in a recent report that was done on democracy across the developing world, so not just in Asia, but also in Africa and the West Indies, looking at the Commonwealth countries, the report, which was published just last year under the auspices of the UN, said that the impact of British parliamentary tradition is all too evident on the parliamentary practices across the world. And this makes it interesting and important when doing the comparisons, and makes it available for someone like Gus O'Donnell to come and look at a little country in the South Pacific and gain lessons for Britain itself. So it means that there are at least comparable and exchangeable terms and institutions and ideas that can be discussed in settings as different as New Delhi, Ottawa, Valletta, and many other parts of the world that otherwise may not have a very obvious connection. There is, as one scholar has called, the studied ambiguity to how the system works, allowing these different cases. Lord Carrington, I think, has left now, but his former colleague, and we were talking about the Hogg family as well, Lord Harshan, spoke in 1976 of the elective dictatorship, talking about the Wilson-Callaghan administrations, though maybe his future prime ministerial boss would be more accurate, where he said that in Britain you live under an elective dictatorship which is absolute in theory, if hitherto thought tolerable in practice. But arguably this happened well before and beyond the Palace of Westminster, across the Commonwealth, where rather than the strong checks and balances and conventions that govern what the British political elite are able to do, these things were forced to be changed and applied very quickly in these different countries. Interestingly, Harshan also said that he was sure that there should be a limited government in Britain, meaning a written or a controlled variety. But this was never really seen to be the case for countries in the Commonwealth in terms of having limited government. The local elites wanted the powers available to a Westminster executive, and of course so many of the colonial elites and the people themselves had operated under the strong, say, viceregal or governor's rule, and they wanted, now that they had their independence, to be able to utilise those same powers they had argued so strongly against all those years. And this had a interesting impact. For instance, it meant, if you look at, say, Pakistan, for example, where they very much wanted to have the Westminster system and got Sir Ivor Jennings to help write their constitution. And Jinnah, when Pakistan became independent, rather than taking the obvious position, as you would think, of becoming Prime Minister, decided instead to become Governor General. And Lord Mountbatten, at that time, and he of course hoped to be Governor General of both independent India and independent Pakistan, told Jinnah that as Governor General he would be restricted and compelled to listen to responsible advice when he instead could have more power as Prime Minister. Jinnah replied, "In my position, it is I who give the advice and others who will act on it." And that's exactly what happened. I mean, there's extraordinary cases, for instance, even with Ghulam Muhammad, when Nazimuddin, the Prime Minister, was thinking of sacking the Governor-General. The Governor-General cut the telephone lines from the Prime Minister's residence and sent the cavalry guard to sack the Prime Minister. So just think of the Queen doing that to David Cameron. Would be quite an interesting idea. But there's plenty of examples like that across the Commonwealth. For instance, in Sri Lanka, Sir Oliver Gunathelaka, the Governor-General, seeing the title of Commander-in-Chief, meaning he was actually in control of the army, and he did take control of the armed forces during the riots there, or Rajagopalachari in India, invading Hyderabad, giving the commands there, or looking, and it's of course not just in the developing world, in other parts of, in the settler cases, there are also many examples. For instance, in New Zealand, the Prime Minister of the day deciding to get rid of the upper house without consulting the electorate, or of course, perhaps most famously, in 1975 in Australia, where Sir John Kerr, the Governor-General, sacked the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, without using these reserved powers. I use these examples because often it's said in the British media and so on that these powers would never be used and could never conceivably be acted upon from the Queen or utilised by the Prime Minister. There are plenty of examples across the Commonwealth where this has, in fact, happened. So another quick recent example is in Canada, where the Governor-General, Stephen Harper, advised the Governor-General to prorogue Parliament to stop a vote of no confidence in his administration, which could potentially have brought down his government. But the point for us, in many ways, is that the Westminster legacy in this respect is that according to one set of precedents, so in that case, the Governor-General did the right thing to listen to the Prime Minister. On another set of precedents, equally valid, the Governor-General should not have listened to the Prime Minister and become the guardian of the Constitution. And arguably both are correct. At the very least, they're both feasible. And these are the legacies that have become very important across Britain, across the Commonwealth. It's interesting that rather these local elites, when they had many different models available to them, for instance, the Indians sent advisors out to Switzerland, to Austria, to Ireland, to America, to Canada, and to many other countries to look at their, and Switzerland, the canton system in Switzerland, and also Gandhi's model, for example, of the village republic, so a decentralized system. But the Indians themselves decided they wanted to have the centralized power that the Westminster system gave them. And it's interesting to note, despite India, of course, becoming a republic in 1950, their new republican constitution, then 250 articles of its 380 articles of the Constitution come from the Government of India Act 1935. So over half of it is a continuity rather than a break. And it's interesting that the executive parts are especially very much close to the British way. Arguably, sometimes India is seen as a success story, but you could look at, say, another example of Papua New Guinea at the moment, which is also a realm and has the Westminster system. And because of a political dispute, Papua New Guinea is in the extraordinary situation now of having 2 governors-general, 2 prime ministers, 2 speakers, and 2 chief justices. It's conceivable that the Queen herself, as Queen of Papua New Guinea, could be called upon to adjudicate and make a decision. Another thing I think is quite interesting, that even, and related to that these countries around the world, even those that have become republics, still want to keep many of this this executive power entrenched in the Westminster system. So last year, as you may have seen, Jamaica made pronouncements that they wished to become a republic. But interestingly, there was no discussion that any of the elements that mark, say, a traditional Westminster system, a weak upper house, a popularly elected lower house, and a ceremonial head of state, none of those institutions was seen to be, the Prime Minister did not make any suggestion that any of those things should be changed. This, I think, is an important, very important legacy across the British Empire, and one of which still carries on to this day. And if you look at it, many of the British themselves were surprised what was happening so rapidly, but perhaps they shouldn't have been. Sir Alexander Morley wrote a dispatch from Tanganyika saying how he thought this was a model system, and how he was so upset that he called it his blue-eyed boy was just as bad as the rest of them. But apart from them having many different coloured eyes, this was in many ways the legacy that is still with parts of the Commonwealth today. How the system has been taken on for the use of many local elites for their own purposes, not always for the good of their countries, rather sadly. In many ways, I think a good quote that summarizes this sort of element is talking about another empire. Harold Lasky said to a delegation from Soviet Russia that in England the country is governed by the rules of a gentleman's club. But when the gentlemen decide that the rules no longer apply, then they'll make their own rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Can you hear me? Okay. No?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay. A woman always likes to have the last word. I'm very conscious that this has been a long day for most of you, so I hope my presentation is going to be like a woman's dress, which is short enough to be interesting, but long enough to cover the subject. For those of you who don't know me, I was born in Shanghai. I left Shanghai with my family a year before the communist takeover. At the time, like most other families, we thought that it was going to be a temporary stay in Hong Kong, that as soon as the civil strife came to an end, we would all return to mainland China from whence we came from. But alas, that was not to be. I went to Hong Kong University, joined the Hong Kong government straight out of university, in the then administrative grade, which at that time, and still is to some extent today, the backbone of the Hong Kong administration. You might ask how somebody like me, who is very, very strongly Chinese in terms of our cultural heritage, can possibly spend the greater part of a career working for a foreign government. I think the answer is very simple. I and my colleagues were working for Hong Kong, our home. We grew up in the service, a service that was a genuine meritocracy, politically neutral, and I learned everything about how to be, I hope, a good public official, which is that you speak truth unto power. That is, to give your honest advice on the basis of objective views based on evidence. And that was indeed your ultimate responsibility at whatever level of the government it may be. We were at that time under British rule. while some of us may have been ambivalent about working for a colonial government, I don't think we were in a hurry at any time soon to come under communist rule. Before Deng Xiaoping famously opened China to the rest of the world, we emerged in Hong Kong as an international financial services and trading center. We exported and produced everything that the rest of the world wanted to buy in terms of watches, clocks, wigs, textiles, garments, and it was actually the product of a remarkable synergy between, on the one hand, the hard work and entrepreneurial flair of the Chinese people, coupled with British governance, which had at its core principles a sense of social justice, the rule of law, respect for the human dignity, rights and freedoms, fiscal prudence, a meritocratic, politically neutral civil service. Perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, the British should have started long before it did to prepare Hong Kong for the reversion of sovereignty. As it is, in terms of the movement towards democratic government, we did not start to move towards representative government until 1982, when we had our first direct elections to district councils. Our legislature at that time was still fully appointed by the governor, and it wasn't until 1991 that we began to have a number of seats directly elected into the legislature. And it wasn't until 1995 that we had a fully elected legislature, albeit through one man, one vote, but also through functional constituencies that represented very small, narrow interests, and also a number of seats elected through an electoral college. When it became clear that the Chinese were unwilling to accept the reversion of sovereignty of Hong Kong to China, but to allow the British to continue to administer Hong Kong, I think the British began in earnest with great determination and with great diligence to negotiate on the future of Hong Kong. And that led eventually to the signing of the Joint Declaration on the question of Hong Kong, an internationally binding treaty lodged with the United Nations, which essentially maintained Hong Kong's lifestyle, its separate social, economic, and political systems, its own currency for 50 years until the year 2047. We are today in the year 2013. At the time when the Joint Declaration was being negotiated, which eventually provided the blueprint for Hong Kong's mini-constitution, the Basic Law. It was envisaged by the drafters of the Basic Law on both the Chinese side and on the British side during the negotiation on the Joint Declaration, that in 10 years' time, after the reversion of sovereignty, that is by the year 2007, that would give enough time, a 10-year period, for Hong Kong to move towards a fully democratic government. That is, on the basis of universal suffrage, one man, one vote. But today, we are still waiting for universal suffrage. Our basic law actually said that in the year 2007, the people of Hong Kong can decide on their own how fast to move towards universal suffrage. But that particular goal has proved extremely elusive. We've had interpretations of the Basic Law by the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. And the latest is that Hong Kong people have been told, forget about universal suffrage in 2007, not even in the year 2012. Hong Kong people will have to wait until at least 2017 to see popular election of our chief executive. And we have to wait a further few years until the year 2020 to see universal suffrage for electing all members of the legislature. The fact is that the lack of early progress on developing a fully fledged democratization in Hong Kong meant that we today have a constitutional framework that is unsustainable in the long run, as we have seen in the 16 years since the reversion of sovereignty to China. We have a legislature of 70 members, but not one voice belongs to the government. We have a chief executive who has no popular mandate and therefore no political legitimacy, because he is elected by a small committee of 1,200 out of a potential electorate of 3.3 million people. So I don't have a vote, and like many others, I take great exception to being told that somehow I'm not mature enough or cannot be counted on to exercise that vote in my hands sensibly to elect our future leaders. As a result of this rather lopsided constitutional framework, which we inherited post-1997, the government is finding it increasingly difficult, actually, to govern Hong Kong, even to pass essential legislation. The latest example is that in the course of debating the annual budget, a group of radical legislature has decided to go in for prolonged filibustering, which has delayed the whole process of passing the budget. And it came to a stage where the president of the Legislative Council decided that enough was enough, and he had to exercise his discretion to cut short the filibustering. We think that in Hong Kong, the fact that even today, Hong Kong continues to make a unique contribution to the sustained economic growth of China and to its modernization. The fact that even today, Hong Kong remains the largest single investor in every city and every province of China. And don't forget, it was Hong Kong money, it was Hong Kong managerial skills, it was Hong Kong professional standards that kick-started the entire Chinese economic growth in the late 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping embarked on its open door policy and a move towards free markets. It is the British legacy of the rule of law, a clean, squeaky clean civil service, the rights and freedoms that Hong Kong people enjoy, particularly freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, free flow of information. These are the pillars of Hong Kong's success, and it is these ingredients that have enabled Hong Kong to continue to make a unique contribution to China's growth. It is a role that for the time being, and possibly not in the foreseeable future, can be replaced by any other Chinese city. Of course, they have the physical infrastructure, but they lack what I would describe as the software that revolves around Hong Kong's core values, which is an independent judiciary, the rule of law, an open, tolerant society. The Standing Committee of the National People's Congress have now told us we can look forward to 2017 and 2020 to elect our chief executive, and all members of the legislature. But what is very worrying is that in recent months, there has been suggestions that there will have to be a screening mechanism to keep out those candidates whom Beijing may not particularly like. It appears that Beijing does not mind election so long as they know who is going to be elected. Well, we in Hong Kong feel that at this stage of our social and economic development, particularly if you look around, you don't have to look to the West, you look around the Asian countries in our region. It is really a little too much to expect Hong Kong to accept that people in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Thailand, and elsewhere can be trusted with a vote. Whereas for a sophisticated, well-educated, pragmatic population of 7 million in Hong Kong, we are still having to look forward to the day when we might have universal suffrage. The International Convention on Civil and Political Rights apply to Hong Kong, both by virtue of the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law. And the United Nations on Human Rights, in its recent review of the third periodic report by the Hong Kong-China SAR, noted with concern the lack of a specific proposal to implement universal suffrage and to ensure that every eligible person in Hong Kong has the right not only to vote, but the right to stand for election without unreasonable limitation. Somewhat in stark contrast, the 6-monthly report to Parliament on the implementation of the Joint Declaration contains some very bland statements to the effect that the British administration looks forward to hearing from Beijing its specific proposals on implementing universal suffrage, leading to one man, one vote for the election of the chief executive and for the election of all members of the legislature. It is disappointing, I think, to many of us in Hong Kong, particularly to those of us who have worked in the old colonial government, to observe how today the British government seems to be less and less forthcoming in terms of speaking with convictions about the slow pace of implementing universal suffrage, particularly against the background of increasing interference from the liaison office, the centrally based organ of Beijing in Hong Kong, and from Beijing in the one country, two systems, a high degree of autonomy, and Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong. Britain still has a huge stake in seeing a successful outcome of the Joint Declaration. And I believe myself, in my previous dealings, in what I observe of how Beijing behaves, that whilst publicly it may not welcome comments from the old colonial regime on implementation of the one country, two systems, it nevertheless does pay attention to international views. And it's not surprising, because given the 4 decades of very strong economic growth in mainland China, one of the things that concern Beijing today is its international image. And I have always argued that whilst ultimately it is up to Hong Kong and to Beijing to faithfully implement one country, two systems, nevertheless, our trading partners, and arguably Britain, that has a unique and historical connection with Hong Kong, it does have a stake in seeing a success of one country, two systems. I'd like to end with a reference to the introduction that Niall Ferguson wrote to his book Empire, in which he pinpointed what he believed to be the enduring and lasting effect of British colonial rule. And that was what he described as a sense of liberty. And he went on to quote this: "Once a colonial society had sufficiently adopted the other institutions the British brought with them, it became very hard for the British to prohibit that political liberty to which they attach so much significance themselves." I think it is to the lasting credit of the British government that it imbued in the vast majority of Hong Kong people a sense of liberty. More than ever, particularly given what we see about what is happening in our country across the border, in the mainland, in terms of repression, in terms of the treatment of dissidents, in terms of endemic corruption. More than ever, we treasure our core values, a large part of which is a legacy of British colonial rule. So I hope very much, having stated that Britain still has a huge stake in seeing a success of the Joint Declaration, that Britain will feel able and willing in future to speak up when they see one country, two systems being eroded, rights and freedoms being eroded, particularly the rule of law, and a squeaky clean civil service. Thank you.
I think we've had two quite excellent papers, and to my mind, what they've shown is the enduring nature of this constitutional legacy, however much it may be, as Dr. Kumar showed, distorted by elites for their own purposes, however much it may be actually suppressed by the mainland government for its own purposes. The strength of this legacy seems to be undeniable, and that's submitted to the papers. But I'm sure they arouse many, many questions. Could we go, gentlemen, come? Start off.
Thank you. I'm Martin Dinham, and I was on secondment to the Hong Kong government for the 5 years up to the transition. I'd like to ask Anson, with the benefit of hindsight, looking back over the 5 years prior to the transition, are there things that, with your experience after the transition, you would have thought that the British government or the Hong Kong government those two really could have done more of or differently to achieve a better result? My second point, if I may, is that what is the single thing which would be most helpful for the British government to do now to make a more effective future for Hong Kong?
Thank you, Martin, for that question.
I don't think that one works.
Oh, that's right.
The other one works.
Okay. Thank you. I think that the Hong Kong people's attitude, particularly towards a faster pace of democratization, changed very perceptibly in the wake of the 1989 Tiananmen incident. I think the British government's view also changed, but so did Beijing's view. And so we had a situation where, on the one hand, Hong Kong people was agitating for a faster pace of democratization because they saw that as a hedge against undue interference from Beijing after the reversion of sovereignty. But conversely, I think Beijing, if anything, wanted to tighten up. And I dare say, in the light of 1989, if you were sitting down to negotiate the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law, it would have been a very different thing. I think given the situation prevailing at the time, this model of one country, two systems, maintaining Hong Kong's lifestyle without change for 50 years, probably in the circumstances was the best that could have been achieved. But I do feel that the whole process of moving towards one man, one vote should have started much earlier than the early 1980s. Because what we're seeing today is a chief executive who is not delivering. The people are not happy with him, but there's not very much we can do because we can't vote him out. We don't have the vote. In fact, the latest election of the chief executive, neither of the two candidates, to speak frankly, were hugely supported by the people of Hong Kong. But there's nothing you can do because you have an election committee of 1,200, out of which possibly 950 votes are completely manipulated by the government or by Beijing or by the liaison office. There were only about 200 odd votes that loosely you could describe as being in the pan-democratic, pro-democracy camp. The second part of your question?
Yeah, what's the single most useful thing that the British government could do now?
I remain convinced that Britain should choose the occasion and choose the manner in which it decides to comment. But when you see attempts to erode one country, two systems, and a high degree of autonomy, and Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, you see increasing and blatant interference from the liaison office, who strictly has no role to play in the internal administration of Hong Kong under our basic law, interfering left, right, and center. Then Britain, as a co-signatory to the joint declaration, I think, should speak up. You can choose to do so publicly if the occasion is right. You can choose to do so behind the scene. But I remember raising it with a group of prominent British business people in Hong Kong, in London, not so long ago. And I was remarking on how Britain was not more forceful in making its views known, in particular to underline, we are the co-signatory, we are watching to see what is happening, we would like to see universal suffrage being implemented in accordance with the basic law. But the reaction I got from one of the British leaders of commerce was, it would be very counterproductive for the UK government to speak up. And he suggested I should go and brief The Economist. Well, so.
So there are two questions. Perhaps the first one on my left and the next one on my right.
Dr. Kumarasingham, on the subject of the Westminster system, what would you say about the changes that have been made in Malaysia because of the continuing two-thirds majority that they've had until recently in Parliament?
Can we perhaps draw that and have the question on?
Ranjiv Gunawardena, about China. In relation to what's actually happening on the ground, I don't actually see how UK could play a hand at this because of the economical crisis, we are relying upon Chinese investments into the UK, and they're trying to attract FDI, which is foreign direct investment, to the UK. So in a way, China has the upper hand here, and the UK is finding it very difficult to play this game effectively. And I don't really see a way out where you can get that suffrage that you're looking for, because the dice have changed. China has so much influence in relation to this subject matter, and it's quite difficult. And I just want to know what's your perspective upon that, because you see the geopolitics China is playing, they're playing a very aggressive role in Southeast Asia. They have a pearl of naval bases from Pakistan to Sri Lanka to Malaysia. And so I just want to know, in the context of all that, how you might be able to get what you're looking for, because I don't think the UK government has a position that they can really afford, because it's all about, it's difficult.
Okay.
Malaysia first, and perhaps China second. Malaysia.
Thank you for your question. I'm sadly not an expert on Malaysia, but the interesting thing about, especially in the non-settler cases of where the Westminster system went, like Malaysia, where there was almost in every case in the former British Empire, there was not a functioning party system, which meant often the power was transferred to a local elite. In Malaysia's case, in Tunku Abdul Rahman's party, and they're now the longest serving party government in the world, I believe. A similar thing, of course, happened in India. So I suppose with the Congress Party. So I suppose my point is lacking a normal opposition, tradition of opposition government party, and as an alternate government, this is a problem for democracy in places like Malaysia, and the latest election is proof.
I would suspect that Anson Chan might have an answer well with the late Lady Thatcher, but
I understand the whole world. The question is.
sorry if I was making that straight forward.
The question really is on what terms you are prepared to trade with China. Are you, for example, prepared to subordinate your values in return for trading with China? It's written as a co-signatory to the Joint Declaration, willing to set aside the promises that are in the Joint Declaration. Now, in terms of universal suffrage, this is not a demand that Hong Kong people have made out of thin air. It is actually enshrined in the basic law, which is our constitution. And all we're asking is that China fulfills the promises that they have made to the people of Hong Kong, which is that in the year 2017, we can elect the chief executive on the basis of one man, one vote. And in the year 2020, at the latest, we can elect all members of the legislature. We're asking for that, no more, no less. And also, if you look at the long-term future of China, it is in everyone's interest that China comes into the 21st century as a fully fledged member of the international community. What does that mean? You don't define a country just by economic might or military might. You define a country by the way it treats its own people. And surely it must be in the interest of the world at large to see not just sustained economic growth in China, but a degree of political liberalization, where there is respect for human beings, where basic rights and freedoms that you take for granted in this country are accorded to the average citizen in mainland China. We see for ourselves the contrast between what we have in Hong Kong, admittedly, as a result of 156 years of British colonial rule. But don't forget basic Chinese entrepreneurial flair and hard work. And we feel that the peaceful evolution towards a full-fledged democracy can provide a sort of roadmap for continuing political liberalization in China. And when you see that happening in China, it is good not just for Hong Kong, not just for China, but it is also good for the world at large.
At the risk of eating to drinking time, shall we take a last question, which I think is a gentleman with glasses on my left. You were hand up, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A simple question about China. To what extent is China's disposition towards Hong Kong influenced by its concerns about Taiwan, Macau, and Tibet?
There is undoubtedly a fear about the contamination effect. The fact that if you were to give Hong Kong people one man, one vote, then certainly different parts of China, particularly amongst a minority group, they might demand the same. But Taiwan is a very, very good example of how a Chinese territory can actually practice well a democratic system. It wasn't, after all that long ago when Taiwan did not have democracy. And in my view, if in Taiwan democracy can be made to work, then there's even a better chance that democracy will work in Hong Kong. We already enjoy a lot of the rights and freedoms that you associate with a fully fledged democracy. And all we're asking is the ultimate realization of a democratic system, which is the right to choose our own leaders, to be given a genuine choice, and not to have somebody of Beijing's choosing foisted upon the people of Hong Kong.
Well, I think at this point, perhaps we really ought to cease, but we've two duties, I think. First of all, to thank Harshan and Anson Chan for two wonderful papers and the discussion that followed. And I think my other duty, very briefly, is to congratulate and to thank both OSPA and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for devising this marvellous conference, for running it so effectively and so genially, and for giving us so rich a feast. Thank you very much indeed.
You're going to ask Willis to have a last word?
Please.
You've already said it.
Yes.
Would you like? Has he said what he wanted to say? Well, shall I just come on?
Yes, why not?
I just want to reassure you, you're not going to get another speech. You've had a long day of very distinguished speakers. But as Vice President of OSPA, my name is Richard Luce, and it's a great privilege to be Vice President of the Overseas Service Pension Association. I really would like to thank not only OSPA, but the Institute of Commonwealth Studies for organising this remarkable conference today on the legacy of the Empire. And for all the hard work that must have gone into the planning of this to get such outstanding speakers. From my point of view, having been both a district officer and a governor, both of which were a great privilege, I was the last British district officer alongside another person who's here today in Kenya. I think it's a marvellous thing to do an objective study of the legacy of the Empire. And it's a great credit to the two organisations to have planned this. We did achieve a few things, and we made mistakes. I remember on my second week as a district officer, there was a demonstration outside my office, and it said, the placard said, "Loose, go back to Siberia." Well, for a start, I'd never been to Siberia. And for the second point is I would have rather liked to have gone back to Siberia. It was extremely hot in the northern province of Kenya. And to this day, I'm not quite sure what mistake I'd made. I'm no doubt I did make a bad mistake that led to that demonstration. So the objective study of the Empire is a wonderful thing to do, and I think it will help a great deal in the public perspective of the legacy that we have. The second thing is that really struck me in listening this afternoon is to be reminded of that placard in the memorial, as it were, in Westminster Abbey. I'm privileged enough to be High Steward of Westminster Abbey, where it refers to the sense of service of the colonial service. And I think that it was a privilege to most people, most of those who were district officers and district commissioners, to serve the people of the countries that they served in the districts they served in. It was a privilege, and it was that sense of service that I think was extremely important. And the last point that I think came out strikingly today was that somehow or other, the best legacy of the empire is the Commonwealth of today. And I think that is a tribute to those who laid the foundations, who were administrators in all these countries, and who left a measure of goodwill in most of these countries, and has helped to transform it into a Commonwealth, which I hope now is getting a new lease of life. So may I thank OSPA and the Institute very warmly for their contribution today.